The Who, of course, and My Generation, and believe it or not, 1965. Derek Shelmerdine's back with me now. Derek, welcome back to the third hour.
Hi, thank you.
1965. How on earth did they manage to write something like that in 1965? It's incredible, isn't it?
Sounds as fresh today.
It does, doesn't it?
I was just saying, I saw the Who in this sort of era at the dance hall in Nantwich, and just outside Chester, when drum kits was still.
What is going on?
Oh, we haven't got a fire. We haven't got an evacuator, have we? We'll carry on and watch for the flames.
Carry on. If we smell it... Oh,
there we go. We're back again. Well, there you go. Just even talking about the Who sets off the fire extinguishers. I can't smell any
smoke, so if you know... If we start to cough, dear listener, please phone 999.
Exactly. We'll kick... Mooney obviously had something to do with that. But that was where they used to destroy the drum kit at the end, and Townsend would smash his guitar into the floor. Absolutely unbelievable. But that was one of the few October highlights for The Who. We get to 1973 and the Quadrophenia tour, things didn't go well. The tour kicked off on the 28th of October 73, and it was unrehearsed, back-in tape problems, because they had a lot of back-in tapes for that particular tour. So for the second night on the tour, they cut 3 of the songs, but it didn't get much better. In fact, a week later, Townsend actually stormed off stage during a gig. And then they went off, they took
Do you know if he came back on again?
Oh, he did. He just threw his toys out the pram and came back.
Again,
but there's a few instances, actually, of him and or others storming off, people leaving the group for a week. In fact, I forget exactly when it was, but Moon and Entwistle left for about a week. Entwistle came back for a couple of days later, but Moon was off for a week. And what they did, this is in the days when they used to play in dance halls and relatively small. They used to use the support band's drummer as the drummer for that week. So you can imagine what it must have been like. Because, I mean, The Who, Keith Moon's drumming style was one of a set.
Yeah,
there was nobody else much like Moon. But, talking of Moon, though, when they got over to America, I think it was the first night, Keith Moon actually collapsed on stage, and that's the very famous instance where the second time it happened, Townsend shouted out to the audience, "Is there a drummer in the audience?" And Scott Halpin stepped on people's heads and ran onto the stage. And for the rest of the evening, he was the Who's drummer.
He actually did 4 songs with them.
Yeah.
But he said, I always remember him saying that at the end of those 4 songs, he was just plain exhausted. He could barely walk. You know, he said how Keith Moon kept it up for a couple of hours. He just he had no idea.
Yeah, I'm just in the middle of reading a biography of Keith Moon, and the guy is absolutely unreal. He really is. If you'd imagine his drumming persona, he is like that on steroids outside. In the antics he got up to. One of life's real characters. And in fact, Keith Moon's last concert was on the 21st of October 1976. But on a brighter note, if you were born on the 9th of October, you share your birthday with John Entwistle, the man behind the phenomenal bass lines that we heard on the My Generation track. But if we come along to the 20th of October, today, what was going on... interestingly enough, there was a lot to do with censorship going on then. Lady Chatterley's lover had just been cleared of being obscene in a court case, a very famous court case in 1960. D.H. Lawrence originally published it in Italy to get around the laws. But we go back to the 60s, and it was a very, very different world. You go back to the 50s, and the 7th of October 1955 was the first reading of Allen Ginsberg's phenomenal Howl, the beat. He was one of the leading beat poets, and Howl was acclaimed as literature, but taken to the courts for being obscene. It was cleared, and Hair opened off-Broadway on the 17th of October 67. When that came to the UK, about a year or so later, the UK laws had just changed, so there was no longer censorship in the theatre, and Hair was the first full frontal nudity that British theatre audiences experienced when that opened in the West End. And actually, a later version of Hair, Meatloaf, believe it or not, actually appeared in. Now, the link here is that he released Bat Out of Hell on the 21st of October, 1977. I mean, it's fascinating, really, how all these things tie together.
Do we know whether Meatloaf was naked?
I don't, actually, but that's quite a scary sight. Really.
I was going to say, I'd have asked my money back if I'd have been in the audience.
But it must be. I did try and find images of, not necessarily to look for a naked one, I may add, for Meatloaf actually in the cast, but I couldn't. Right. I could actually find any, which is quite sad. He's another guy with a.
And do you know in the Dutch version? Do you know who was the orchestra band?
No.
Focus.
They're not.
They were.
Oh, right.
Yeah. I don't know if it was the entire band, but that's basically where they met and got themselves together.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
It all links together, doesn't it?
I don't know if it was in October, though.
Yeah. Well, some of it could well have been. It's run for years in various places. And still running with the theme of October and censorship, Lenny Bruce, who was very famous, iconoclastic American comedian, was always being arrested for being obscene because he would use the naughty F word a lot, and he was also heavily into heroin and the like, and eventually died of an overdose. But if you were born on the 13th of October, you will share your birthday with Lenny Bruce. He's actually very funny, and he was one of his arrests was quashed about 5 years ago by, I think it was the mayor of New York. One of the times that he was arrested, because they decided that perhaps the FBI were a little bit over enthusiastic in their chasing of him, because after all he was a comedian. The Who was still doing good things. In 1969, they had a 6-night run at the Fillmore East in New York with Tommy, they'd released about 6 months earlier. And Led Zeppelin's Song Remains the Same, that had its premiere. Jimmy Page was a big Aleister Crowley fan, and in The Song Remains the Same, each of them do a little vignette, as it were, and he actually set his in, because he bought Aleister Crowley's old home, and he set his little piece there. But I think the saddest thing that happened today was 1977. It was the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash.
Was it really?
Yeah, that killed three of the band. Yeah,
they had a terror. I mean, it wasn't just that. I think a little while later, one of them died in a car crash or something. And
well, what happened? He was very badly injured,
right,
in a car crash. He survived the plane crash,
yeah,
and then he was paralysed in a car crash. And he was actually done for what they call DOI over there, driving under the influence. And when 10 years after this, Skynyrd got together again. Well, some of the ones that were left and some others, and he actually acted as the MC, and he would start the concert by speaking about the misfortunes that can fall of drinking and driving.
We're getting strange sounds again, aren't we?
We are, aren't we? This has
never happened before. What is going on?
we just push on. Exactly.
Yeah.
But one of the things interesting, MCA withdrew the sleeve because only 3 days earlier they'd released Street Survivors, the album, and it pictured the band standing in a street, sort of apocalyptic street, and the street was completely on fire. If you imagine flames right across the cover and the band standing in front of them. When the plane crash happened, MCA withdrew it and they reissued it with a plain black sleeve. So if ever you're browsing through them, if you find one with flames, it's the one before the crash, and the one that's just black is the one after the crash. But I think the other interesting thing about this era was Jimi Hendrix was having some interesting times. He signed a deal with Ed Chalpin on the 15th of October 65, and that was before he got involved with Chas Chandler and came to the UK. And it's a very long story, which will obviously be part of a Jimi Hendrix story later. But basically, when Hendrix became famous, Ed Chalpin went after him, and those legal wranglings carried on long after Hendrix's death. One of the things he did agree, Hendrix, is that all the royalties from Band of Gypsies went to Ed Chalpin, but that never really stopped. And the experience really, the 13th of October they started. They did their first ever gig supporting French rock and roll hero Johnny Hallyday on a very short tour of France. And on the 25th of October 68 they released Electric Ladyland, and that's basically when Chas Chandler, the manager, and Noel Redding, the bass guitarist, fell out with Hendrix for various reasons. So that really marked the end of the original Jimi Hendrix experience. On the 23rd of October 66 they recorded Hey Joe, their first UK single. But leading really into the next track, on the 1st of October 1966, Hendrix jammed with Cream. Cream were playing a college gig in London, and Chas Chandler said, "Hey, I'll introduce you to Eric Clapton," and he did. Hendrix got up on stage and played with them, but apparently Clapton threw his toys out the pram. That he almost gave up playing the guitar, apparently, because Hendrix was just so good. And the track that they actually jammed to was Howlin' Wolf's Killing Floor.
Howlin' Wolf there, and Killing Floor. Now, where have I heard that recently?
Well, probably if you were listening to Led Zeppelin's The Lemon Song on Zeppelin 2, that is actually Howlin' Wolf's The Killing Floor. And in fact, Howlin' Wolf did say to the Zeppelin boys, "Look, I'm going to take you to court for very large amounts of money." And they actually then decided they'd include Chester Burnett, Howlin' Wolf's other name, on the credits for the Lemon Song. There are actually several other tracks on that particular album which were subject of lawsuits with Willie Dixon. But more of that at some other date. I think this is an interesting time for the Beatles. You could almost tell the Beatles story from October. On the 18th of October, McCartney played his first gig with the Quarrymen. He'd missed the Quarrymen's debut at the Cavern a couple of weeks earlier because he was away at scout camp. Then they became Johnny and the Moondogs. This is just Len McCartney and Harrison. And they were on Carol Levis's Star Search. They didn't win, but they did get through to the regional heat, or past the regional heat. But on the 15th that was the 26th of October, on the 15th of October 1960, Pete Best had joined. They were now called the Beatles, and they recorded together for the first time, John, Paul, George and Ringo, because Ringo was actually there with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. And actually it's John, Paul, George, Ringo and Wally Walters, who played bass, who was actually the Ringo Starr, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes bass player. But if you've ever wondered where the iconic Beatles hairstyle came from, it came from that first Hamburg trip. What had happened, the bass player Stuart Sutcliffe had met and was very friendly with a lady called Astrid Kirscher, a professional photographer, and she was very much in the arty set, the beatnik set. They called themselves the Exies, existentialists. And for John's birthday, John and Paul decided they'd head off to the continent, and they got as far as Paris, and they met up with Jürgen Vollmer, who was part of that particular set, and he had his hair. The Exies all wore their hair in this Beatle comb-forward style. And John and Paul persuaded Jürgen to style their hair in that same way, and that's basically where exactly where the Beatles hairstyle came from. Now, if you look at photographs from the era, you'll find Pete Best never actually styled his hair that way, and some of the school of thought is that there were several rifts in the band as to why Pete Best disappeared and Ringo came in, and the other things that carry on. On the 19th of October, the Beatles and Jerry and the Pacemakers actually got together, called themselves the Beatmakers, and for one night they performed as one particular unit. Now, on the 31st of October 69, the Beatles released something with Come Together, and that actually has its own story. But just before we get to that, John Lennon released Imagine on the 8th of October 71, and featured in his movie How I Won the War, opened on the 18th of October. And if you were lucky enough to be born on the 9th of October, you share your birthday with said John Lennon. Now, Come Together was actually another plagiarism lawsuit, and that came from Chuck Berry, because John Lennon actually incorporated some of the lyrics from You Can't Catch Me when he wrote it. And this is a very, very long story. But it transpired a happy ending of sorts. John Lennon, on his album Rock and Roll, included a couple of Chuck Berry songs, Sweet Little 16 and You Can't Catch Me. But that is a really interesting story of itself. It was produced by Phil Spector. Phil Spector pulled a gun and all sorts of things on John Lennon. But this is the Chuck Berry song, You Can't Catch Me.
I was trying to listen very hard to the lyrics. I mean, apart from the little bit where he says, "Here comes old flat top."
Yeah.
Is that it?
That's basically about it.
That was the only bit?
People take these things very, very seriously. Well, it wasn't so much Chuck Berry. It was actually his publisher, Levy, Morris Levy, I think, who actually went for it.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got, like Alan Klein, you know, if you've got the letter of the law on your side, they went for it in a big way, which is why you find the Verve's, what are the Verve tracks? Bittersweet Symphony is actually credited to Jagger and Richards for exactly the same reason. They had an agreement to sample a Stones song from Andrew Lou Goldham, and Klein decided they'd take them just a little bit too far. Sue. So, lots of these stories in rock and roll. Some people make lots of money. It's not usually the artist.
Yes.
But I mean, one artist to look out for, though, if you're looking at some of the old-time guitarists who were influencing people like Hendrix, is a guy called Guitar Slim. And on the 27th of October, 1958, he released a track called The Things That I Used to Do. Guitar Slim was famed for dressing in very flamboyant outfits and dyeing his hair, colouring his hair, weird colours to match. And he had this is long before radio guitar leads, and he had a very, very long lead, and he was known to actually wander right through the crowd, because they play in theatres in those days, and out in the street, and he'd be playing in the street with this incredibly long guitar lead. Another first really was 27th of October 1955, James Dean's film Rebel Without a Cause opened, and that was the dawn of the teenager. There was no teenage culture, believe it or not, before the mid-50s. But it's also very much that era was the time of the Cold War, the West communist thing, and the 23rd of October 1956 was the Hungarian uprising, which the Russian tanks crushed within a few weeks, and the 17th of October 1962 was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world really did come within a gnat's whisker of World War III. And interestingly enough, in the news today, we seem to be moving in the same sort of direction that we were in back in 1962. So maybe the one thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. 9th of October 1967, Che Guevara died. If you've never heard of him, you've almost certainly seen his image on a million T-shirts. He's the guy with the beret. He was the revolutionary hero of the 60s. But one of the reasons for really looking at the Cold War was that a guy called Willy Stoff, East Germany's defense minister, was quoted around the time of saying that rock and roll makes youth ripe for atomic war. And the next track is Bill Haley. And Bill Haley comes in because he was, on the 26th of October 1958, he was just starting to tour Germany. And people, the fans there were ripping up the seats. Nobody had seen anything like it. And he was the face of rock and roll at that time. He was the first rock and roll hero, really, before Elvis. But if you wondered what sounds rock and roll made for Willie Stoff to think that it makes youth ripe for atomic war, this is Shake, Rattle and Roll.
Bill Haley, of course, and Shake, Rattle and Roll. Again, another piece of music that, as good as it is, I probably would never have played it on this show. So it just kind of shows that, you know, doing this sort of feature allows other things to filter in that we wouldn't normally play.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic piece of
Let me just turn
rock and roll.
yeah.
Classic piece of rock and roll.
Yeah.
But October was also an interesting time for the Rolling Stones. A guy called Brian Knight. If you were born on the 14th of October, you share your birthday with him. He's one of the unsung heroes of British R&B in the early 60s. He was one of the guys that was in Brian Jones's very first lineup, and then he split off and went and formed Blues by Six, and that was when Mick Jagger and Keith Richards joined Brian Jones. Charlie Watts actually played for Blues by Six as well. He left Alexis Corner to play with him. It was a very incestuous place, the R&B band era of the early 1960s. But on the 27th of October 62, they actually made their first ever recording session at Curly Clayton's studio. I mean, there's a great name to conjure with. And the band at that time was Mick, Brian and Keith, with Ian Stewart, Tony Chapman, the drummer, and possibly, sources vary, Dick Taylor may or may not have been bass player that particular day. He went on to found the Pretty Things band. And that was very much the big... You could argue that they failed their first audition in the same way the Beatles did, because when that particular tape was hawked around the record companies of London, Tim Panally, nobody wanted to know.
Do you know what was on it? What tracks?
I do, actually. It's in the book,
right.
But I haven't got it noted. They're all R&B, blues R&B covers from the likes of Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters. There's about 4 or 5 songs, I think. But if I brought a copy of the book, of course, we could have checked it out. And interestingly enough, the beginning of the end for the Stones came on the 30th of October, 67, when Brian Jones pleaded guilty to drug charges. And he was actually sacked from the band a couple of years later, a week or so before he died. And now, if you were born on the 24th of October, you share your birthday with Bill Wyman. And talking of sharing birthdays, now there's quite a batch here, so I'm just going to pick 2 or 3 at random.
Can I just say something?
Absolutely.
Here? Are there any on the 29th?
29th. Yes, Denny Lane.
That's not bad, that's not bad.
Hey, that's you, is it?
It's the same as me.
Hey!
Yes.
Yes,
I'm thinking of having a birthday this year.
Oh,
so,
it's worth having them. I love birthdays.
Yeah.
I love Christmas. I love birthdays.
Well, birthdays are wonderful, aren't they?
Yeah.
Week Saturday.
Well, there you go. That's a party.
Well,
got to be a party. Got to be some rock and roll there.
Yeah.
But if it was the 3rd, you'd have been with Chubby Checker. If it was the 28th, you'd have been with Graham Bond. And the 12th would have been with Rick Parfitt. But if it had been the 28th, also, it would have been with Elton Dean. Now, Elton Dean was in a band called Bluesology with a singer called Long John Baldry. And another chap who wasn't very keen on his existing name, but he really liked the name Elton, and he really liked the name John. So he decided that he was the pianist in Bluesology, and he decided to call himself Elton John. Sadly, there were a couple of very notable deaths in October. Janis Joplin, as we mentioned earlier, and Duane Allman died on the 29th in 1971. But one of the more bizarre episodes on the 26th of October 1973 was Fleetwood Mac. There was a band that had nothing to do with Fleetwood Mac, who were legitimately touring America as Fleetwood Mac. And what happened was that guitarist Bob Weston had a bit of a thing going with Mick Fleetwood's wife. Now, Mick Fleetwood took a very, very dim view of this, and halfway through their American tour, he decided that that's it, I'm going home. So he cancelled the tour, the band went home, but the manager, Cliff Davis, still had some American commitments, some gigs to do. So he pulled a bunch of guys together and called them Fleetwood Mac, and they continued the tour. The fans took a dim view of this.
Were they still they were playing Fleetwood Mac material?
They were Fleetwood Mac. I mean, this was Fleetwood Mac. What happened was Clifford Davis thought that he owned the name, so they took him to court. They got the name back. He didn't own the name. But what happened was that Elmer Gantry was part of that band, and they actually stayed together as a band, and they called themselves Stretch. But, I mean, Elmer Gantry found fame in his own right with a couple of albums. But, I mean, I thought that was a are really nice. There's a few examples of people touring, but never quite where the managers just put another band together out of nowhere, and suddenly they are there. In fact, like the next track, the Fleetwood Mac Man of the World, that manager certainly saw himself in that way.
Gorgeous, gorgeous song. I was just telling Derek, when we was just at school, like sort of leaving time at school, we was in a band. It was one of the tracks we used to cover. You can't imagine a band doing that, can you really? But we used to. I don't know why. I guess perhaps it was one of the only songs that the guitarist knew, and so we thought, right, we're doing that. And we did it. And I can remember doing it, actually in front of people and everything, performing it and everything. So,
performance.
But what a beautiful song. Absolutely gorgeous.
I've got some very, very good news for you as well.
For me?
For you.
For me. I like the sound of that.
On the 29th of October.
Wow.
1946.
Oh, a bit before me.
Peter Green. You share a birthday with the one and only legendary Peter Green.
So from Denny Lane, it moves up to Peter Green.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, there are small birthdays to come.
And he doesn't live too far from here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I might nip round it because
party.
I'll drive round to I know roughly where he lives, and I'll go round there and I'll look for where there's a few balloons hanging off the front gate, and that'll be his house.
That'll be him,
and I'll go in there.
And he'll say, "Oh, I hope Dave comes. It's his birthday today as well."
And he's only 12 years older than me, so we're bound to be listening to the same music.
Well, he'll be listening to that. We have that on the car radio, mate. Oh, he wasn't in the band then, but he did play with them again after that. When one of the guitarists sort of found God and walked off an American tour. But that's another story. 24th of October, 1968, LSD became illegal in America. Now, you tend to think of LSD as one of life's serious drugs, and it has always been. No, the CIA actually had been experimenting with that for years. People like Ken Kesey of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Merry Prankster's fame, he was actually involved in the 59 Menlo Park Veterans Hospital experiments where the CIA were actually doing it. But eventually they decided they'd make it illegal. And if you were born on the 22nd, you actually share your birthday with Timothy Leary, famously Turn On, Tune In, Drop Out. There's one, actually, I must just say, somebody who possibly couldn't spot talent. On the 2nd of October 1954, Elvis made his only appearance at the Grand Ole Opry, and Jim Denny, the stage manager backstage, said to Elvis, "Look, old boy," although he probably didn't call him old boy, "I really think you should return to truck driving. You're never going to make it as a singer." Well, I don't know if Jim Denny's still there, but Elvis certainly made it as a singer. And one of the other big, certainly on the music scene in the 60s, the Vietnam War was a very, very big influence. And there was a lot going on. On the 21st of October 67, there was a march to levitate the Pentagon with a view to actually driving the evil spirits out of the Pentagon. And throughout the war, one of the things that made the Vietnam War very, very unpopular was a bombing program, continuous, relentless bombing called Rolling Thunder. And it had started on the 2nd of March 1965. And President Johnson actually ended it on the 31st of October 1968. This is when the war had really turned against America. And on the 16th of October 1973, the Nobel Peace Prize was won by Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho for the first peace agreement in Vietnam. Now, Lee Duc-Tho refused to accept his because he believed that the war wasn't over, because the South were still fighting the North. Henry Kissinger accepted his even though he didn't go there in person. And I thought a really interesting combination here is on the 30th of October 1975, Bob Dylan started off his Rolling Thunder review, and this included people like Joan Baez, Allen Ginsberg, Ramblin' Jack Elliott, Mick Ronson, Joni Mitchell. And there's a superb 2-CD record of that. There's a duet of Bob Dylan singing Blowing in the Wind with Joan Baez. Well, it's a protest song. He's protesting, basically.
I was protesting.
Yes, exactly. Now, if that happened in a gig, you tend to find that musicians get very, very angry at the sound crew. Pete Townsend famously pulled his sound man across the stage. Oh, there's a mark on it.
Big scratch on the CD, I'm afraid. So, yeah, we can't do that.
Oh, that's virtually new.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that.
Anyway, we'll carry on. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was just saying that, musicians can get quite upset when things go wrong on stage. And Pete Townsend famously pulled, I think his name was Pridden, the sound guy that was doing the stage mix. And he actually physically hauled him over his equipment onto the stage in one particular fit of peak. Now, the 1970s and October were very, very good. 8th of October was a very, very good day for Ramones fans, because in 1948 Johnny Ramone was born, and on the 8th of October in 1965 CJ Ramone was born, so two for the price of one, as it were. And if you happen to have your birthday on the 9th of October, you'd share it with Jackson Browne, and on the 13th of October you'd share it with Sammy Hagar. But there was couple of classic singles arrived around this time. Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody was released on the 31st in 75, and The Damned's New Rose was released on the 22nd in 1976. Now, The Damned are interesting because of the various punk bands. They had the first punk single with New Rose. They had the first punk album with The Damned. They did the first punk tour of the UK with Mark Bolan. I think it was the last tour that Mark Bolan actually did of the UK, because he sadly died in a car crash shortly afterwards. And they were actually the first punk band to play America when they played CBGB's. So the Damned really did manage to get the whole raft of gold medals for the firsts on the punk scene. And quite an interesting album on the released on the 19th of October 79. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers released an album called Damn the Torpedoes. And if you were born on the 20th of October, you would share your birthday with Tom Petty.
Oh.
Now, the title for that particular album is actually a famous quote, or it's the quote that, as it's usually stated. And it was a guy called Admiral David Farragut. And at the Battle of Mobile Bay in the American Civil War, he was actually the guy that said, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." And that's very much gone down into common parlance now. And certainly Tom Petty obviously liked the sound of it. But it wasn't such a good time for Jim Morrison. It was on the 30th of October 1970 that the Doors played a gig in Miami, and he very famously got arrested for obscene behaviour. And that particular incident, it then shadowed him for the rest of his life. I mean, he died in 71, and he was still awaiting trial when he died. And in fact, it's arguable that it really brought the Doors' career to an end, because after that particular incident, an awful lot of the promoters cancelled gigs. Radio stations weren't playing their music. And before Jim Morrison actually went off to Paris, where he died, he'd had a bit of a hissy fit on stage. He rammed a microphone stand through the stage, and the Doors basically just decided to call it a day.
It's quite funny, because nowadays, if somebody did that kind of thing, they'd look on it in completely the opposite way and think, "Oh, good, this will sell tickets."
Absolutely.
Yeah, but they obviously just thought, "Oh no, they thought that would keep people away." But I mean, perhaps it would have done in those days. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it was a much more puritanical time. I mean, you look at that's the sort of late '60s. I mean, you look at the Sex Pistols, and they've got a few interesting Octobers as well. But when they were on the Bill Grundy show, which is actually December, and they said the naughty F word, and it caused absolute ructions. Bill Grundy, the host of the show, was sacked virtually on the spot. The local councils, who seemed to control the dance halls where the Sex Pistols were just about to go off on tour, because that's what they were promoting, of something like 30 gigs, only about 6 or 7 actually survived. And again, now, I mean, I've been watching a comedy thing on the TV called The In-Betweeners, and it's a word that is peppered throughout the script in just mainstream comedy. I mean, how times change.
They do, indeed.
Very much so. But I think one of the audiences to have been in was to have been only one more person than us, actually. 3 people. So you, me, and maybe Pete Green.
Yeah.
If we'd been in the Last Chance Saloon in the fabulously named Poughkeepsie, New York, we'd have been the 3 people watching the Police.
Oh.
When they started their American tour, they were not well known.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, but Rolling Stone magazine actually has that. They did this 20 rock and roll concerts to change the world kind of thing some years ago, and that was one of the concerts that they listed. Apparently, it was very good. But can you imagine playing to 3 people? I once saw the Kinks in Connors Quay, my hometown, and there were about 20 people there. I was in a band at the time, and we'd come back from rehearsal, and we heard them there, and we got in for like a tenth of the price, and there were only literally a dozen or so people in there. And
was this at the Kinks when they weren't known?
No, that was the Kinks. No, they had released You Really Got Me.
How strange.
So, well, what had happened is the guy who owned the... Oh, no, I won't say that. Well, the ballroom's gone, the Crystal Ballroom. This was a long time ago. Right. He'd said that the Beatles were coming, and people flocked there, and the Beatles never came. So when he said, the Kinks are coming, nobody believed him.
Right, we're getting to near the end, aren't we?
I think we are.
Amazing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's amazing how
So what are we going to finish on then, Derek?
Well, I thought what we'd finish with is, rather than listen to Bohemian Rhapsody, which is a fine piece of music, go with Freddie Mercury's Barcelona. This guy has an unbelievable vocal range, and is just an example of a rock singer singing virtually classical music. You just don't hear anybody else achieving. Never usually works.
No, you don't. No. Derek, you'll be back again midway through, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through November.
Yep.
And we'll be doing something else.
Absolutely.
We don't know yet. Do you know? Because I don't know.
It'll be November. Yeah. The second part of the show will be November. All the good things that happened in November.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure. And, really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it.
Have a good month, whatever you're doing. And I won't be here next week. I am actually having a proper week off. I'm not ill or anything like that. I'm just taking the week off from everything. Hopefully, I'm going to put my feet up. Hopefully, I'm going to drink something rather nice, and hopefully, the sun will be shining wherever I am. But I have no plans whatsoever yet. But I definitely won't be in. But one thing I can definitely tell you is that next week, Mr. Guy Bellamy, he who does the rock show on Fridays at 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock, he'll be sitting in for me next Thursday, and I think he's got an interview with the blues band King. So I'm not sure whether they're coming in or whether he's actually done the interview yet, but he's already done the interview already. But hey, well worth listening to. So I'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Thanks very much for listening. Derek will be back in about a month's time. And taking us up to the 11 o'clock news, we got Mr. Freddie Mercury with a bit of help from Montserrat Cabelli. Good night.